Hey everybody, this is Dwayne France, the founder and host of the Headspace and Timing podcast and blog, a show dedicated to changing the way that you think and talk about veteran mental health. I'd like to give you a quick preview of tomorrow's podcast. I had a great conversation with combat veteran and New York Times bestselling author Karl Marlantes. You'll know Karl from his best-selling book Matterhorn. And he and I talk a lot about a bunch of different things. Him coming back from Vietnam and his viewpoints on mental health. So I'd like to go ahead and get into the conversation. So first, to start off with, Karl and I talked about his experiences in Vietnam, in which he was in the mountains and didn't have the ambiguity of being in a counterinsurgency like a lot of, like myself and a lot of current veterans today. He talks about his outlook on and the impact of 19 and 20-year-olds stuck in ambiguous situations.
It was absolutely, if you could identify it as someone that wasn't your side, you could shoot. If you can't send a military organization into an environment where they can't act like a military organization, then maybe you ought to be thinking about sending in the State Department or the police force or something like that. We've been misusing our warriors. They're young. They're 19, right? I mean, putting them in these moral dilemmas where they're trying to figure out whether to pull the trigger or not. And then with the fear of getting court-martialed if they make a mistake, I'm just going like, you've got the wrong people there.
As I've said on the show before, Vietnam veterans often have to hide the fact that they served because they didn't want to get the backlash from the people in the community that they were working with or going to school with. In this clip, Karl gives an illustration of how far many Vietnam veterans went to avoid talking about their service and how some of Karl's peers felt about it.
We had really close friends, that my wife, my first wife, and had been in college with this other woman, and so they knew each other from college. And we were both married couple, and our kids about the same age. And Barry was the man's name. He and I coached the soccer team together, and we'd pick the kids up after school. We'd switch off. We'd have overnights. And after about 6 or 8 years, the wives were talking and found out that Barry and I were both Marines in Vietnam. That's how underground the Vietnam veterans went because of that horrible reception. Now, the country has learned from that. And I've had many, many people come up to me and say, I don't know what was going on. Why did we behave that way, non-veterans? We went kind of cuckoo, and the country did. And it was just casting their darkness onto these young kids.
Karl and I also talked about his novel Matterhorn, and he carried it around for about 35 years before it was published. And we talked about why he feels it was relevant when it was published due to the parallels between Afghanistan and Vietnam.
The first draft of Matterhorn was done in the 70s, and no one would touch it. I couldn't get a single person to even read it. I'd get letters from agents or publishers in New York saying, we lost that war. No one wants to hear about it. We couldn't sell this book to save our souls. And it took 35 years before it got published. And I think a lot of it was because what we were involved with in Afghanistan in particular, but Iraq looked pretty seriously close to it. It was eerily similar. I mean, rules of engagement, they could run across the border. We couldn't shoot them. We were supporting corrupt government. No one understood what was going on. The rest of the country didn't care. The Taliban wasn't, storming the beaches of Santa Monica. I mean, it's pretty hard to tell a 19-year-old he's defending his family when his family's out shopping. So all of that was eerily similar to the Vietnam situation.
Karl's also been an outspoken advocate for therapy and mental health counseling. In this clip, he tells a story of how he first approached counseling in the mid-90s, nearly 25 years after he left Vietnam, and met the therapist who he credits with helping him resolve these issues, Dr. Larry Decker, who was a guest on the podcast back in episode 99.
I had never heard of post-traumatic stress, never heard of it. And I was doing some really weird behavior. I bumped my head against the cabinets in the kitchen, and I took the cabinets out with my fists. I mean, I'd be up in the middle of the night. There'd be a noise. I'd be out on the street stark ass naked. My first wife, who she and I are great friends now, we didn't know what hit us. That was what the problem was. No education. She saw something for a free counseling session at the local school in the cafeteria, a bunch of local counselors for job stress. And she said, "You're under a lot of job stress. I mean, you're really behaving weird." And yeah, I guess so. So I went down there, and I'm sitting there, a bunch of people in the school cafeteria, and finally my turn comes up, and I sit down at the table with this guy, and he starts asking me some questions, and I start telling him about some of these weird behaviors that I just mentioned to you. And he looks at me and he says, "Were you ever in a war?" And when he said that, I burst into tears. I didn't know what hit me. I mean, I'm talking about snot running out of my nose, bawling for 10 minutes. Finally, I start to get back to, and he looks at me and he writes on the back of a card. He says, "Larry Decker." He said, "I'm going to call him on the phone, and you're going to go see him now. Not tomorrow, not next week, not this afternoon. I'm calling him now, and you're walking down to see him, and you better show up. You have something called post-traumatic stress disorder. Have you ever heard of it?" "No." "Well, you got it." and so I'm stumbling down the street literally with this card in my hand. I walk into the vet center, and Larry had a client right at that time, and he came out and he said, "I'll see you in about 20 minutes. And that started me on therapy, and it basically turned my life around because I was a complete wreck.
We also discuss the impact of combat-related stress reactions on our families, and Karl describes how his kids, especially his oldest daughter, tried to make sense of his behavior.
The kids learned to deal with me. I mean, they would actually take turns waking me up. I woke him up last time. It's not my turn. You wake him up. Because I'd come out of bed, jumped. But one of the things is that nobody understood that Dad wasn't crazy. Here's a great one. My again, the same daughter. She said, "Why was it that if I dropped the milk one time, you would just be fine? You'd say, let's just clean it up and be absolutely calm. And if I dropped it another time, you would go through the roof, scream, jump, scream at me." And I went, "It's because if you dropped it in front of me, I was fine. If you dropped it behind me, it set me off because of I was right back into the combat situation and I wasn't thinking anymore." And if you could just tell the kids, Dad isn't crazy. If you scare him or startle him, that triggers something in his brain which has been changed because of combat, and this is the result. Don't do it. Or if you do it and he goes off, you can make a joke about it. It's not, don't get so serious about it. Just understand it.
And finally, Karl has some particular advice for clinical mental health counselors who are working with veterans, and for veterans who feel like they can't talk to anybody who hasn't been to combat.
I think just for therapists out there that you are no less effective because you don't understand, quote unquote, what it's like to be in combat. Nobody understands what it's like to be in combat except the one guy who's talking to you. I mean, those people who have been there understand it, but that's very, very few people. What they're looking for is someone to listen to them, someone who's safe to talk to, someone who reaches them as an individual. That has nothing to do with combat. I mean, what therapists give to everybody, but certainly to veterans, is that ability to just sort of unburden your soul, and then have somebody who doesn't have your particular, peccadillos and irrationalities point out paths to you that you might not have thought of, and or maybe your thinking's just a little confused on this issue, and that doesn't take any understanding of combat. It goes two ways. I mean, combat veterans, and believe me, I'm one of them, have a kind of a disdain for people that haven't been there. That gets in your way too. I mean, if you want to rejoin society, you got to get off of that high horse.
As you can see, we're still trying to work out some of the technical details, but this was a great conversation, and Karl and I talk about a whole lot more in a longer conversation. We go in depth about his experiences in returning from Vietnam, his thoughts on the responsibility of a nation for the conduct of his warriors, and his latest book, Deep River, which is on bookshelves now. If you want to get the episode when it comes out, make sure you hit subscribe on your podcast player of choice. Thanks for taking the time to check this out. I'd really like to invite you to learn more about veteran mental health. There's a couple of books that are available there, veteranmentalhealth.com/Amazon. And if you really want to keep up with all of the good work that we're doing and the information that we're providing, I suggest that you reach out, connect on the podcast. This is an example of the iTunes podcasts. You can go to veteranmentalhealth.com/podcast, hit any one of the icons, hit subscribe, and then you'll be subscribed. Thanks again, and make sure to continue to check out this channel for more information about veteran mental health.